Hello, welcome back to our video series on Christian sexual ethics. So this is the first video after the introduction. So this is kind of like unit one of our discussion. And in this video, we're going to talk about why God designed sex in general and specifically for humans. So what is his purpose in sex? God is the creator, originator of all things. Why did he create sex in the first place? Well, the first answer is fairly obvious. It's for reproduction. But he didn't necessarily have to create sex for reproduction. There's two forms of reproduction in biological systems that organisms on our planet can do. One is asexual reproduction, and the other is sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, there's only one parent. So basically, one parent produces a copy of itself. It basically clones itself. It basically divides a cell and produces a new cell with the same genetic makeup that it has. So it produces basically a younger clone of itself when it reproduces. Now, God could have designed it so all organisms reproduce asexually. And it's very efficient. You don't need to go out and find a mate. Just anytime you need to reproduce, you can just, there you have, you just produce a new cell, and there it is. You have another copy of yourself. But sexual reproduction has some advantages, and the main advantage for sexual reproduction is that it gives diversity. So that diversity is really important when you have changing environmental conditions. And the environmental conditions on our planet, on Earth, this planet that God created and has given to us, they're constantly changing. They're going through all sorts of changes over time. Sometimes those changes are really rapid. Sometimes those changes take a real long period of time for them to occur. But things are always changing. And so if you have organisms that are all the same, all identical to each other, they can't really adapt or have qualities or features that allow them to kind of keep up with the changes and survive under different environmental conditions. And so sexual reproduction is really good in that it allows for diversity, genetic diversity. So the genes that organisms pass on from their parents to the offspring, those genes give rise to certain specific traits, certain types of physical characteristics. And those physical traits or characteristics that we scientists call phenotypes, those phenotypes have features that allow them to be better adapted to certain conditions than others. So for example, if all dogs had only short fur, they might be well adapted to really warm climates, but they wouldn't be really well adapted to cold climates. Whereas dogs with longer fur would be really well adapted to colder climates. So having that diversity, having that ability to have different organisms within the species that have different traits, different phenotypes, or different physical characteristics allow for them to be better adapted to changing environmental conditions. So it's kind of like a way of hedging your bets. So it's really kind of an interesting, kind of unique, elegant way in which God designed organisms to reproduce sexually, and he provided for a mechanism for them to do so in such a way in which allows them to adapt to conditions as they change in the habitat that they might find themselves in. So we see within biological organisms, sexually reproducing organisms, there's a number of different ways or mating systems, mating styles that they have for sexual reproduction. For example, plants, fungi, many fish species, they do what we describe as indiscriminate pollen or spore or sperm release. So if you think of plants, and if some of you suffer from allergies, you might be particularly sensitive to this and recognize this when you hear about high pollen counts. What pollen essentially is it's plant sperm. It's basically male plants putting out sperm, or the male part of plants putting out sperm or pollen into the air just indiscriminately, and it will hopefully find a female part of the same species of that plant and be able to fertilize it and produce a new plant. Some organisms, they release spores indiscriminately, like some fungi, some ferns and some fungi, they'll just release spores that go into a body of water and then can be fertilized. Fish, for example, fish might just release sperm. Male fish might release sperm into the water and hope that that sperm fertilizes a female fish, a female fish eggs. And then the female just may lay her eggs and then hope that sperm fertilizes them. So it depends on the organism. And then most mammals, including rodents, so things like mice and rabbits and stuff like that, ungulates. So ungulates would include like deer, elk, moose, things like that. So hoofed animals, and then primates, so monkeys and the great apes. And then also most carnivores, they practice what is known as polygamy. So that's where you have one male mating with several females. And they'll do that seasonally, where one male will basically be the male that is allowed to mate with several females in a given area. So that's known as polygamy. And then most birds and some mammals like coyotes and wolves, they'll practice what's known as serial monogamy or monogamy. Serial monogamy is where animals mate for a breeding season. They have one mate, so one female, one male, they will mate with each other for a breeding season, but then after that breeding season is over, they'll go off their separate ways, and then during the next breeding season, they might come back together, or they might find another male or female of the same species to mate with. Monogamy is just more straightforward, where you have lifetime pair bonding between species, between organisms within a species, where you'll have a male and a female that'll mate for life. So humans are unique from other animals in the animal kingdom, and thus we have a somewhat unique mating structure. And if you look at human culture, human history, you'll find that there are a variety of mating and family structures that humans have practiced in different cultures. But what seems to be pretty consistent is that monogamy is the most common, and it seems that humans have been designed for monogamy. If you look at the way God created us, God designed us, it seems like we have certain features or adaptations that mean that we are designed for monogamy, for one man, one woman mating for life. So human beings are unique from other sexually reproducing organisms, including mammals and primates. There was a song that came out back in the 1990s by a band called the Bloodhound Gang called The Bad Touch. It's kind of a crude song. In that song, there's a line that they'll repeat over and over again in the song that says, "You and me, baby, are nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do it on the Discovery Channel." And this song kind of promotes this kind of concept that's kind of become increasingly popular in our culture, that basically we're nothing more than animals. And so if we're nothing more than animals, we should just indiscriminately go out and have sex whenever we want, like animals do. Well, there's a couple things that are wrong with that song. One is that we aren't anything. We aren't just animals. We're something different. Human beings are unique, and our sexuality is unique, and we'll see that. But another thing is that for the most part, animals just don't go out and indiscriminately have sex with each other. Like if you look at, like, for example, deer. Deer have a specific mating season called the rut season, where males will mate with females. That's when females are actually receptive to being mated, to mating with males. They just don't go out and have sex anytime. Other times of the year outside of the rut, males will live in their bachelor herds. Females will live in their herds along with the fawns, with the fawns that they have. So the does live separately from the bucks. If they do come together during the summer or the spring or something like that, they just don't start mating with each other. The mating behavior only occurs during the time period in the rut where the females are receptive. So most animals just don't go around having indiscriminate sex. So the song is incorrect on a couple of different levels. But let's take a look at what's unique about human beings that really seems to indicate that God designed us for monogamy. Well, one feature that's unique about human beings is that the human female has concealed estrus. So the human female has a period each month where she is ovulating. So that's the period of time when she's ovulating is when she releases an egg, and that egg is receptive to being fertilized by the male sperm. Most animals don't function like that. Most animals, when they have estrus, they come into heat, and the males know that the female is receptive to being mated, to mating with. And the female has certain biological instincts that kick in that make her more receptive to mating with males at that time period. So they'll put out scent markings. There'll be obvious signs to the males and to other females that this female is in estrus, that she is in heat, that she is actually capable of physically reproducing at that time. That's not the case with humans. Human beings, we have concealed estrus. And so when a female is ovulating, we really don't have signals or cues that tell us that. We don't know at which point in the month she's ovulating. Now, with our advances in culture and technology and understanding, we have learned ways in which we can track the female's monthly menstrual cycle, and you can get a rough estimation of when she should be ovulating, but there's no outward obvious cues that she's ovulating. It's just by tracking the cycle you can get an idea of that. We also now have technology where we can, by a woman testing her urine at different times in the month, she can kind of figure out where her hormonal levels are. But that's not something that would have been available to anybody in ancient times. So essentially, in humans, when a woman is ovulating, when a woman is actually able to become pregnant, is actually completely concealed. Another feature that's different in humans is that the female of our species, females, they can experience orgasms, and they experience pleasure from sex. They have an organ, as a matter of fact, that was designed, as far as we know, specifically just to provide pleasure during sex, and that's the clitoris. Other organisms don't have that feature, and that feature's only design appears to be to provide physical pleasure for a woman during sexual intercourse. There's no other explanation that we know of why it exists. And so what that means is that there is definitely a pleasure component to humans having sex. Other organisms probably have some sort of pleasure. Depending on the organism, it may be more or less. There is some evidence that, for example, some dolphins and some primates do have some pleasure from sex. But for the most part, most organisms only have sex when they need to, when they are compelled biologically because they are actually receptive to breeding at that time. That's why they have sex. So they have an instinctual component that compels them to have sex when they're actually able to reproduce. Humans, though, it goes beyond that in that we actually have derived pleasure from sex. Then also another feature about humans is the extreme dependence and vulnerability of the pregnant female and the mother and child for many years post-partition, so post actually giving birth. So when you think about the human female, when she's in her third trimester of pregnancy, she has the large stomach, she can't move as well, she's a lot more dependent, a lot more vulnerable. And so what that promotes is having the father of her child support her, help her in what she's going through. It's more challenging and difficult for her to provide for herself and her needs during that period of time, that extended period of time, than it would be otherwise in her life. And if we see other organisms, no other organism has that extreme vulnerability and that time period where the female is limited when she is gravid, when she is pregnant. They don't have that extreme period of vulnerability. When you see like whales, or think about like a dog or something that's pregnant, a lot of times you may not know a dog is pregnant until a couple days before it gives birth, and then she gives birth. And certainly for an extended period of time, she's not very limited or restricted. And most animals are that way. Most animals have very few limitations until pretty much maybe just hours or minutes, or at most a couple days before they give birth. For humans, that period of vulnerability extends way beyond pregnancy. So after a woman gives birth, she's also pretty, it takes her some time to recover. So she's pretty vulnerable in that state when she's recovering. Other animals, they give birth and they're up on their feet, they're running around, they're doing whatever they need to do to survive right after giving birth. But for the human female, it takes her at least a few days to recover. And even then she has this tiny infant that is incredibly vulnerable that needs to be cared for. No other infant, no other baby in the animal kingdom is so vulnerable as the human infant. When you think about even other animals that are somewhat similar to humans, like gorillas or other great apes, baby gorillas, they can crawl around, they can see within a couple days of being born. They're already crawling around and moving around. They are very dependent and very vulnerable, but nowhere near to the extent that humans are and for the duration of time that humans are. I mean, basically, it takes a human being pretty much around 18 years to be fully raised to adulthood. So that's 18 years of dependency. So now imagine that a woman is trying to do that all by herself. We see the problems with single parenthood, the problems and challenges that single mothers face. So now imagine that back in hunter and gatherer days, or early days of agrarian culture and farming practices, just how vulnerable the woman would be. What that really shows is that she really needs the father there with her, committed to her. All these differences in humans, we show that the father really needs to be there. If the father wants to ensure that he is the father of the child, and that both he and the woman want to ensure that she gets pregnant, then the male and female, they have to stick around and they have to have sex repeatedly with each other, because they don't know when the female is going to be receptive. And the fact that they derive pleasure from sex means that they want to have sex frequently and repeatedly. And then the extreme dependence of the woman and the child, both during pregnancy and post-pregnancy, really accentuate the need for the father to be involved during the lifetime of the mother and the child. So all of these promote monogamy and marriage and that commitment between the husband and the wife, the father and the mother. So that brings us to basically what the second reason is for why God designed sex for human beings, and that's to strengthen the marriage bond. So for humans, sex is about more than just procreation. That is why both males and females desire sex year-round, not just when the female can conceive. So we desire to have sex year-round. Basically, all the time we desire to have sex with each other. Whereas in animals, most animals only really are compelled or desire to have sex during their specific mating season. If you look at birds that are migrating in from their winter habitat, a lot of times the males and females live in completely different areas. They then come together during the spring. The males will build a nest. They'll attract the female, and then the female and male will be compelled to mate with each other. There's hormonal and instinctual factors that are at play there. They compel them to mate with each other. They lay eggs. The female incubates the eggs. Sometimes the male shares in that responsibility. Then they have chicks that hatch. They feed the chicks fledge, and then they go out on their own. The male and female then go out on their own and split to separate ways. There's some of you may have seen in the news. There's piping plovers that have been mating in Chicago at Montrose Beach over the last few years, and the male is named Monty, the female is named Rose. This is a pretty exciting story because these are the first piping plovers to be mating in the Great Lakes in this area for quite some time, and these are an endangered species, a federally listed endangered species. Well, Monty and Rose, they met each other and they mated, and eventually they had a successful mating. And then what they see is that Monty and Rose during the winter, they go to completely different areas. Like one will fly to Florida, one will fly to Texas. They live in completely separate areas during the winter. But then during the spring, during the mating season, they both come back to the same place at Montrose Beach, mate with each other, raise chicks, and then in the winter, they then migrate away to their separate areas. So they're only compelled to mate with each other during that specific time. But what we see with human beings is that they want to mate year-round. They desire each other year-round. It's not just when the female can conceive. And so both the male and female receive pleasure from sex, and ovulation, like I mentioned, is concealed. All of that shows us is that sex is for more than just procreation in human beings. So sex is God's gift to strengthen the marriage bond between the husband and wife, and it enhances the emotional connection between the spouses. There is even a spiritual component. So let's take a look at some scriptures that talk about this. First, we'll take a look at Genesis 2:24. So in Genesis 2:24, it says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. They become one flesh." So the idea that these two people, these two individuals, now become one. They're not just separate people that are just kind of connected for a brief period of time. They have now become one, and they are connected fully for as long as they both live. Matthew 19:4-6 says, this is Jesus speaking. "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" So there we see that Jesus is clearly saying is that these two individuals, they become one flesh, and once they have become one flesh, they should not be separated. They should stay together. That is part of God's design for sex in human beings, is to enable reproduction, but to strengthen the marriage bond so that this couple remains united in perpetuity. And then 1 Corinthians 6:16 says, "Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh." So in this example, it's talking about something that isn't God's design, but illustrating again that significance of that sexual connection, creating one flesh, of taking two people and uniting them together in one being, in this kind of spiritual component. So sex is for procreation. And we talked about that, how sex is for procreation. Now it's for reproduction, but it's also to strengthen the marriage bond. And the two really go hand in hand. Strengthening the marriage bond enables human beings to have and raise healthy children, have healthy families. By strengthening the marriage bond, it also allows sex as reproduction to function in such a way in which the marriage bond and the family unity is strengthened. So that provides, if it strengthens the marriage, it provides a strengthened family structure to raise healthy children. So let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 7:1-5. "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps for mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So this is an interesting passage, but I think what it really kind of gets to for our discussion here today is that sex is something that is to be actively shared between the husband and wife, and that it really strengthens the connection between the two of them. And in strengthening the connection between the husband and wife, it strengthens that foundation to have a healthy and strong, supportive family for raising children, so that healthy, emotionally secure, and stable children can be raised that can then go out into the world and flourish. And so God created sex for a specific purpose and a specific purpose within human beings for reproduction and to strengthen the marriage bond between one man and one woman for perpetuity as husband and wife, so that they could then go out and raise healthy children that would flourish in every way, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, would go out into the world and flourish. Well, thank you for listening to this part of our series. Stay tuned for the next video that we'll talk about, that will deal with what are the biblical standards regarding human sexuality.